Very glad to be here. I want to thank Centair for inviting me. As Dave said, I've known Dave for a long time before he was with Centair. And I'm going to talk about myself in a minute. But I'm really happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the practitioner side of things. So it's been really a fun journey for us at Johnson Controls. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our company, a little bit about me and what we've been doing. And I'm happy to share my thoughts on that. So without further ado, here's my agenda. So I think it's important you know who I am. I'm certainly probably the least famous person in the pamphlet if you're a big Agile Scrum person. And a little bit about my company. Then I want to talk about the product. So we have a brand new product offering that we launched last October and we're releasing now. Sounds confusing, I'll explain that. And I want to explain that a little bit too, give you some context. So then I really want to get into why and what we're doing with Scrum and Agile. So a little bit on why we decided to go with Agile at Johnson Controls, what we've learned, and I'm a big fan of best practices and lessons learned. That's sort of how I view continuous improvement. I always look at what have we learned, good and bad, and what are the best practices, and then try and carry those forward. And I really broke that down into 3 categories. We've been doing this at Johnson Controls for a little over a year, and I really broke it into 3 areas. The beginning, how did we start? The launch, so we actually had a public launch of the product last October, and then the actual release to the paying customers, which is happening right now. So in each of those sections, I'm going to talk about the lessons learned and the best practices. And then what are our next steps? So as I said, we've been doing this for about a year. We fully intend to continue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do next. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end if I keep myself honest and watch my timer here. Okay? So a little bit about me. I thought it was important, as the folks in this room who work with me know, I like to get to know people because it gives you another level of understanding how to work with each other. I wasn't going to put the cheesy clip art in. Dave Race made me do it, so that's his fault. So I've been at Johnson Controls 20 plus years. In fact, I hit 20 years this last January. I actually wrote software for about 8 years, and then I transitioned into various other project management, engineering management assignments. I did spend 3 years overseas. I mention that because it gave me a very different perspective on things. Being in a remote location, dealing with the different cultures and the language and time zone aspects has given me a personal perspective. Little plug, I'll put little plugs in here, not always necessarily Scrum or Agile. If any of you get a chance to go work abroad, do it. It totally changes your perspective if you haven't done it before. And currently I'm responsible for about $20 million of product development work annually. So I'm running the team that's building the product I'm going to talk about. I threw this picture in here, I'm hiding in the back there. So we've got a pretty large team. And actually this picture is just the employees. Now there are a few of my bosses in this picture as well. This picture is actually taken, we won an award for the project we're working on. But right now we have about an equal number of consultants and contractors and employees on the program. I'm going to intentionally not get into too many of the details. Some of that my company considers to be kind of confidential. But I'm going to share enough with you so that you can really get something out of the case study. Okay? My personal experience, I think it's important for you to know my experience with Agility and Scrum since I'm up here talking to you. I was introduced to Scrum. I had heard of Scrum before. I'd read, Ken mentioned the 15 to 16 page overview of Scrum. That's a great overview. I keep it at my desk. I was introduced to Scrum by Centair in 2010. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Here's where a few of my coworkers in the room will groan. I've never actually been to Scrum training. So Dave and Chad always give me a hard time. You got to go to training. You got to go to training. They're right. I haven't taken the time to do that. I'm going to do that soon. But it's important for you to know that, so my perspective really is all learned. So keep that in mind as I talk, okay? And I have been one of the key stakeholders, so I'm not a practitioner per se, but as the leader of the team, I'm one of the key stakeholders in the sprint reviews. And we've done over 20 sprint reviews to date. And really what I did to prepare for this presentation today, we've archived all those reviews, not only the presentations, but we videotaped them. And then we have the sprint retrospectives. I'm making a big assumption that most people in this room know most of the Scrum terminology. If I use a term you're not familiar with, please let me know. But the way I figured out how to present was I looked back at our 20 plus sprint reviews. And it was kind of interesting to do. Since we've been doing this for over a year, the early ones I kind of looked at them and cringed a little bit. And then we got into the middle of it and I was like, okay, we're kind of rolling now. And then they've been really good lately. And it actually helped build the framework for my presentation. A little bit about me. Once again, I like to get to know people. I've been married for 15 years. I don't have any kids. I'm an avid photographer and cyclist. That's actually me. I don't usually put that picture in there, but once again, Dave wanted clip art. So. And then the last thing, and I do this sort of in jest, but in all seriousness, everything I'm going to say today is really just what I believe and think, okay? So none of this is necessarily the views those infomercials where the TV channels are like, hey, whatever this guy's saying is not on us. Anything I say today is really my view of the world, not necessarily my company's, not necessarily Centair's, not necessarily ALM Chicago. Following Ken is kind of fun because it's going to be interesting. 90% of what I'm going to say is in line with Ken, and then I got a couple opinions that are probably a little different, but they're based on my experience. Okay? So let me tell you a little bit about Johnson Controls. I don't want to bore you too much with the corporate state of my company, but once again, to give you perspective. Pretty big company, Fortune 100 company. I think last year we were 76th on the list. $34 billion company, very global, 150 countries where we actually sell products and services. We've got 162,000 employees worldwide. So it's a big place. Really, we have three major business divisions. Once again, I share this for context. There's the Building Efficiencies Division, which I'm a part of, where we build products and deliver services and solutions around buildings and energy efficiency. So if you've seen any of the Johnson Controls trucks driving around, they're white and blue. Actually, they may be white with a green logo now. Those are our trucks that are out servicing facilities. And we've got a pretty large market share in North America and in the rest of the world. We have two other divisions. We build a lot of batteries, both the lead acid batteries in most of our cars and now some lithium ion batteries, and that's been a very lucrative business for us. And then automotive, the thing we're probably least known for, but it's one of our biggest businesses, is automotive experience. What the heck does that mean? The interiors of most of your cars, except for some of the Japanese models, most of the rest of the world, the interior of that car was actually probably manufactured for those car manufacturers by my company. And we're starting to cross-pollinate across the divisions, but it's been a challenge. And really my focus has been in building efficiency, which is what I'm going to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about product development at Johnson Controls. As I mentioned earlier, I've been there about 20 years. We build a lot of stuff. If you think about a bill of materials for parts you can buy from Johnson Controls, there's a ton of stuff there. And I have a couple images here. We actually have a lot of equipment that we make. So on that top line are various pictures of valves and actuators, all that mechanical stuff. The guys with the fancy pencils like to design and build. We build really large equipment. That chiller that's in the green there would fill a room. Probably not this room, but probably half this room. So we build some really large mechanical and electrical stuff. And of course, as Ken alluded to in his presentation, almost everything has software in it now. So most of these components have a software piece to them as well. Our flagship automation product, which I've been a part of for a long time, is called Metasys. It's our building automation product. Simplest way for me to describe that to you is it's all about 72-degree air, creature comfort, lighting, fire safety. So I honestly don't know if we're in this building or not. It would probably be a safe bet to say we probably are. Us all being comfortable in this room is what the building automation system does. We've got about 40% market share in North America on Metasys. It was first released in 1990. I joined Johnson Controls, as I said, about 20 years ago. I missed the first release, but I was there for the second release of the first generation. We've done 3 generations of this product. Really, generations here are about technology and enabling behavior. The first generation of this product was classic, thick client, loading floppies and CDs onto a PC, and then connecting via network to the rest of the system. The second generation was web-based. That was our first foray into web-based. If I were to show you some of the screens from our first foray there, we'd all laugh because it's pretty archaic, early 90s stuff. And then our third generation, which I helped get out the door about 7 years ago, so we're 7 years into it, was really, truly a thin client hosted type of application. So most of the experience that I have and most of the other software folks at Johnson Controls have is around this product line. We have an interesting challenge, which I know there was a presentation yesterday about Scrum under a waterfall. It was hinted at earlier today. Because we make all these products, our company, with really good intentions, and quite frankly it's worked well, has one product development process. So literally at a high level, the guys building those valves and the guys building those chillers and those of us building software, we actually follow one phase gate process. It's very waterfall in its nature. It's very manufacturing-centric in its nature. But the nice thing about the process is it really prescribes what you need to accomplish, doesn't tell you how to do the work. So as I'll talk about later, one of the challenges when we decided to go with Scrum, how do we fit that into this process? And we've been marginally successful at that. What I would tell you, and knowing this is being videotaped and might get back to my management team, the output of what we're doing has proven to be far more important than that process. But the good news is, from an ISO audit perspective, from lots of things that our customers expect, we're still able to follow that process. But it has become secondary to the way we do work, which is good. And since I've been there for 20 years, I really didn't want to speak about, we've been doing software at Johnson Controls for 45 years. We actually built one of the first microcomputers that was ever used in a building, working with some manufacturers at the time. Most of the development, no surprise to people in this room, in my 20 years was all done waterfall. And the way I think about waterfall is the words I put up here: requirements, followed by design, followed by code, followed by test, followed by manufacturing, rinse and repeat, right? That's the waterfall world we've all lived in for those of us who've been doing this for a while. And there's pros and cons to that, and it made a lot of sense at the time. It's a challenge. A lot of the things Ken talked about earlier, I personally have experienced in my career. We also dove into, how many people in this room have heard of TSP, PSP? Okay, a few hands have gone up, good. So about 5 years ago, we have a relationship, I should have mentioned I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where the Johnson Controls headquarters is. We have a really strong relationship with the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and one of their professors there, a guy named Dr. Seaburn, he's very connected to Carnegie Mellon and SEI, and about 5 or 6 years ago at that institution, they started teaching team software process and personal software process to their students. And the thing that I really liked about it, which it shares with Agility and Scrum, it really is self-directed. Maybe not as much as Scrum and Agility, but at least self-planning. So instead of a bunch of project managers off in a room doing a big Microsoft project plan or something else, lobbying, give me estimates over the wall, the team actually commits to the plan, which is one of the things I also like about Scrum. So we had very good success at predictability with that process, but quite honestly, it was because we were working on a mature, well understood product domain and set of requirements. So we introduced this 5 years ago, already 12 years into that Metasys product line. And they're still using it on the Metasys side of the house, and it works pretty well. We'll talk about in a minute why I didn't think it was the right thing to do for the new product we're going to talk about. I have a reference in there for anyone who, it's always good for us to all learn about different processes. If you go hang out on the SEI website, they've actually taken TSP to an integrated level. I haven't kept up with it, but it's kind of an interesting read for those interested. And now I'm going to switch to talk about our product and what we did with our product. The name of our product is Panoptix. There's a long story I can tell you over lunch about where the name came from. My boss's boss, who's the executive of our division, is a marketing guru, and she put a lot of thought and effort into that. And we've done an excellent job, best I've seen in 20 years, of marketing this product. So that's where the name came from, and we're using Scrum. So I'm going to read this to you, and I don't like to read in presentations. I'm going to move around and drive the video guy nuts here too. This was the vision of the product. So I don't have this memorized, but let me read it. The Panoptix system is a complete solution, a combination of software and services that are more easily and cost-effectively help you achieve optimized building performance and energy efficiency. Whew. Featuring an open platform, cloud-hosted application suite, and an intuitive user experience, the Panoptix solution simplifies a traditionally very complex process by collecting data from disparate building systems and creating a single, integrated view of building and system performance. I need a drink. There's a reason I did that. Not to bore you all with what the product is, but it's a pretty complex deal that we're doing here. And this picture sort of helps tell the story. The other challenge we've had, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, we're not just building a software product, we're actually taking a whole new offering to market. So the picture that's on the right there in the top left, and luckily the screens are pretty big in here, we're building a whole bunch of applications. And that's really what I'm responsible for. But at the same time, in parallel, the business is actually rolling out 3 other initiatives around this program. So in the top right, we have a connected community. It's the Facebook of building automation. Kind of cool, I'm kind of proud of it. I would encourage everybody in the room to sign up, not because you're building geeks, but there's a lot of technology talk going out there too. Some of my Centair friends are out there, and we've, actually Dave's been a pretty prolific poster, which I appreciate. We're trying to build a connected community of like-minded individuals who care about their buildings. So we're really not just trying to deliver software, we're trying to use some of the social media technology. We actually stole a guy away from Microsoft, sorry guys, who was involved in their social media, and he's been running that site, and it's been pretty successful. The bottom left is what we call live guide support. So as I mentioned in that crazy paragraph there, this is a cloud-based offering. What I would tell you right now, it's truly a hosted offering. We're moving to the cloud pretty quick here. We're using a third-party hosting provider, but it's definitely a software as a service offering. And unlike our traditional products at Johnson Controls, instead of sending something out of our factory on DVDs and saying, we're going to install it and then good luck, every one of our customers, the day they sign up, not only do they get a URL to their site, they get a live guide by name, a human, they can contact via chat, via the phone, and they'll actually meet that person when they first engage them as a customer. So once again, those 3 areas, we're trying to use technology to really enable our customers. This 4th piece is what we've had for 100 years as a company, our field services. So as those 3 pieces are helping the customer learn about his building, that's when we make money, when we roll a truck to help them. So it's kind of a neat value proposition for our company. We've really never done the live guide or the connected community piece before. And it plays a little bit into the thinking we've had around the product development. Okay? Doing pretty good on time here. So here's the product. Now once again, I'm not trying to train you on our product, but I always like to show what we're building, and I've got just a few slides here. It really is an energy dashboard as a starting point. As that big paragraph said in the last slide, we're trying to actually build a platform for all of the building information in the building. And we had to start somewhere, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Really where we wanted to start was a dashboard of the energy information in the facility. There are a lot of our competitors who are doing parts of what we're doing, but we really believe that we've got the first offering that really provides all the information about the energy in a space. So just a couple of slides, screenshots here to give you a sense of what we've built here. This is a dashboard. These are configurable per user, just showing what's your carbon and energy footprint in a building on the left or across a suite of buildings. The middle area, and we've got some nice intellectual property around that, diagnostics. Analytics is a big word. If you watch any of the smart grid stuff, or if you watch TV like I do, everybody's got the green space, and IBM's big in this space. We have a partnership with them. Really having analytics about what's happening in this building. So it could be perfect 72 degrees air in here and we'd all be comfortable, but the equipment in the ceiling might not be working right. In fact, it might be working wrong to make us comfortable, which costs Microsoft or the owner of this building money. So really we're trying to provide value to the owners. And on the right, everybody's got a dashboard. From our automotive friends, we use a little speedometer here. This actually is a neat little feature that shows you if you start a retrofit project, if you decide to go green in your facility, what can you project your savings to be, and then we'll track it for you. So some really nice features in this first offering. These are the actual, that last page was the dashboard, and there's configurable widgets there. These are the first 4 applications. And I really show this because I'm going to talk about this later. We really have built from a user or customer perspective 4 big applications. And the Carbon Energy Reporter, which shows your energy profile of a building or a suite of buildings. The Continuous Diagnostics Advisor, that's that faults, what's going wrong with the equipment, which you may not know. The Energy Performance Monitor, which is how much money am I saving with these projects. And then the thing that we call the Custom Analyzer, which deep dives and shows you all the data in your building. Just 2 more screenshots. One of the things we've put a lot of focus on in this product is the user experience. Still a little too much white in this area for my liking, from my previous UI days, but we've really put a lot of emphasis in how do we make the navigation of the system clean to people. We've traditionally, like a lot of software, large enterprise software vendors, had big, huge stacks of documentation or a huge, crazy help system where you click on that help and there's just tons of stuff. We've really minimized the amount of documentation and help that's available here for 2 reasons. Number 1, the product's pretty intuitive. And number 2, as I mentioned earlier, there's that live guide that you can call. And then I show this screen just to show you that there's quite a bit of data involved here. This is actually a pretty simple screen. I wanted to make sure it showed well on the screen. These are our analytics, and every one of these little graphs represents information coming from the building up to every 15 minutes. And we're already, even though we're in the early phases, we're already up to several terabytes of data with our first 7 or 8 customers. So it's going to get pretty daunting in terms of data management. That's why I walked over and checked big data on the box there. Any questions before I get into Scrum and Agile about me or Johnson Controls or this product? Probably the least important part of the presentation in a way, but I wanted to give context. Okay. So let's talk about my rationale to go Agile. As I said, these are really just my thoughts, but I think a lot of this was shared by several of the leaders at Johnson Controls. And none of this will probably surprise anyone, but it's really what motivated me. Lots of firsts to manage. Having read several, like I said, I haven't been to Scrum training, but having read several different articles and things that Chad and Dave point me to, if there's a lot of firsts, you're going to have a lot of change. And you're going to have a lot of variables. So to be stuck in that 12 to 18 month waterfall, I'm going to talk a little bit more about you don't know what's going on there, would be really hard when we had all these changes. And these are some pretty significant ones. This is our first release of a cloud or hosted offering. So that created not only some technology challenges, but some business model challenges. most of the business leaders on this program, I'd say about 2/3 have been at Johnson Controls a long time, so they have a certain way of thinking. It isn't a bad way of thinking, but they had to change their mindset as business leaders. We also have a very complex, ever-changing market space. In that building automation space I talked about earlier, creature comfort in buildings, there's really only 4 people of significance doing that in North America. In this energy space where you and you and you could go use any number of technologies, get access to data, and build dashboards, hundreds of competitors. And they're always changing. And it's pretty easy to put out what I call demoware and excite people pretty quick. So 4 guys in a garage are who we're competing against sometimes now in this space. And they're getting really good at it. The most challenging part is getting the data in and out of the building, but that's now becoming almost a commodity. So now you're really into software people can provide value that opens it up to rooms full of people like this. So we have to be cognizant of that. And then probably my personal biggest challenge as a leader of a group of people, 90% of the people are new to Johnson Controls on this program. So literally, I can't overstate how insane this has been in a good way. About a year ago, 90% of the people that are working on this product development were not at Johnson Controls. It's a mix of new hires and consultants. And that's been challenging. It's been great in a way because we've gotten really talented people because we've held the bar high. And it's actually helped from a Scrum perspective, but it's been a challenge because when you bring that many new people in, it's going to hurt at times. Okay? So lots of firsts to manage. So as I was hurting my head a little over a year ago with Dave and Chad, I was like, wow, this is going to be hard to manage. How are we going to do this? So that was one thing that was in my head. Second thing, and this comes up a lot whenever you talk about agility. By the way, whenever I use quotes, it's usually because I'm trying to make a point. Avoid those long planning and design phases that we've all been stuck in. Those of us who have been doing this for a while. I have previous experience that was painful. I think I still have scars with really long planning phases on large enterprise software endeavors. People locked in rooms for days, weeks, months, building documents, capturing things on whiteboards. Plan, 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 plan. Planning's good, not the way we used to do it in most organizations. And lots of design and scale and performance challenges. And traditional thinking at my company is if you have design and scale and performance challenges, you better sit in rooms and plan and plan and plan and plan. What I was thinking about a year and a half ago, how are we going to know that before we build the software? A lot of that can't be set in stone ahead of building the software. And to be honest, once again, knowing my boss will see this was my boss's biggest concern when we went to Scrum. How are we going to know where the little time bombs are in our architecture and our design if we don't plan all that out? So we had to take a bit of a leap of faith there. And last, and probably most important to me, is frequent and transparent real progress was desired. For a couple obvious reasons and maybe a not so obvious one. First and foremost, this is a very highly visible initiative within our organization. Our company took a risk, a good calculated risk, to go into this space. We haven't been in this space before. As you can probably speculate, when I told you 90% of the people are new, that tells you my company had to invest in something new as well. And that was a pretty big risk for a big conservative company like mine. Glad they took the risk. But with that kind of visibility, you can't go dark for long periods of time. We had lots of stakeholders with lots of good input. And I didn't put that in parentheses. This is not me taking a shot at the business people at Johnson Controls. There's a lot of talented people that I work with on the business side, but we're actually delivering this solution to a whole bunch of different units of our company, and they all have a different perspective. So how do I get all those people on the same page, right? I don't possibly have enough time in my day to be giving status updates to these people. And oh, by the way, as a leader, as a middle manager, my status update is going to be based on my opinion. I got to show them the software. And that last thing, which feeds back to that long planning design phase, I've been a part of too many projects where, how's it going? It's going okay. When are you going to have something you can show us? Give me about 6 months. How you doing? Well, I got a bunch of metrics. I'm going to make fun of myself in my metrics slide later based on something Ken said earlier. But those long, quiet periods of uncertainty are really tough. And as a leader, you hate them because then you're just relying a lot on faith, right? So I called up Chad, called up Dave, I was scratching my head, and I said, guys, I'm really worried about this stuff. What are we going to do? And at this point, the team was pretty small, so we had an opportunity to do whatever. And so after several conversations with the guys at Centair, we decided to take the Scrum plunge. And those were fun conversations, I can tell you. I was a little stubborn about a few things they were telling me. I'll admit to that, right? 12 steps. But I was convinced, based on what they were telling me, that even though it would be painful to learn something new, this was the right thing to do for our organization. Okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to break this down into sort of 3 sections. So, in the beginning, how did things go? And there's a lot of things I could share here, but I tried to, kind of keep it simple. Here are my personal lessons learned. Starting small was a good thing. So, we actually were funded to start bigger. I could have gone out and with my peers hired a lot more people. We chose not to do that. It was sort of a little bit of dumb luck, to be honest. I'd love to tell you that was proactive. But quite honestly, finding really good, talented people, like all of you, can be hard, especially when you got to go find them off the street. So part of why we started slow wasn't because I looked into my crystal ball and said this is going to be the right way to go. It's because it took us a while to find the people. And we held a pretty high bar on what we expected. But I would tell you, starting with one team, we literally did start with one sprint team, was a good thing. Now that team, and at least one person in this room, Gary Pedretti, who's over there, was on that team. They did 4-week sprints for a little while. And we eventually, pretty quickly, over a 3 or 4 month period, because of the amount of work we had to do and we were finding the talent we wanted, we grew to 4 teams, and they stayed on 4-week sprints. Now, I liked the way we organized then, and we're still trying to follow this model. We had 2 teams very focused on that customer-facing piece I showed you earlier, and then 2 what I'd call back-office teams. We had a team that was called the shared services team, so they took care of things like security, data interaction models, et cetera. And then we had the team that actually Gary and Eric, who were in the room from Centair, were on, which is the configuration team. As you can imagine, to connect software to a building is a non-trivial deal. You actually have to have some tools to do that, and that's what those tools were. And then we started with those diagnostics. From a business value standpoint, of those 4 applications I showed you earlier, the diagnostics was the one we really thought was going to have the most value. So that's where we started. The other lesson learned, which I think is true all the way through this, but certainly early, patience is a virtue and necessary, especially early. So even that first team, if I think back, probably 1 or 2 people on that team had ever used Scrum before. And as we went to 4 teams, probably 1 or 2 more had used Scrum before. So there were several challenges. One, having nothing to do with Scrum, although it felt like at the time Scrum and Agile were getting in our way, they weren't. Everybody wanted more time to do more work. How are we possibly going to get something done in 4 weeks? We got a blank sheet of paper and you're telling me 4 weeks later I have to demo something to our stakeholders? Oh, painful, right? So there was a lot of consternation about that. And I have to admit, some of the people that were on the program at the time and the ones that have gotten over it are still on the program, the ones that haven't. Luckily at a big company like Johnson Controls, if we have talented people and they want to work a certain way, we can usually find another place for them. They're kind of set in their ways. There were some people who were really struggling with the basic concepts. Really, you're telling me in 4 weeks I have to demo something or show something of business value? I can't do that. I'm used to getting 4 months to do stuff. We had some very interesting early conversations around Scrum says to do ... Well, I don't want to do that. I don't care what Scrum says. And I can distinctly remember a conversation I had with Chad where it was almost like Scrum was becoming this person. Scrum was this person that you couldn't see, but he was off telling everybody what to do. Scrum says to do this. And I was like, where's this Scrum guy? And I liked what Ken said. I hadn't met Ken before this morning. I liked what Ken said earlier. It's a framework. So to blame Scrum for things that aren't going well, in hindsight, doesn't make a lot of sense. And there were a couple of with all the best intentions, some of the people who knew Scrum were trying to educate, and with all the best intentions, the people who didn't know Scrum, and this wasn't everybody, were struggling with it. So I viewed it as really kind of misunderstanding, talking past each other. We've gotten past that, but it was tough early. And one of the things we really struggled with is that definition of done. So for those of you who know Scrum and have at least read the 15, 16-page overview, one of the things I like most about that entire document is make sure you have a clear definition of done. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. We were really inconsistent on that. We would, and once again, no fault of the people, but I can remember in like our 3rd sprint review, one of our developers started demoing something that wasn't done by the definition of done. He had checked it into our environment. It worked, but he hadn't run the tests. And the folks on the team that were very experienced Scrum people were all cringing. They're like, oh, you can't show that. Do not show that. Do not show that. Well, he learned not to do that again. And it was just really hard early, even with a small team, even with 4 teams, to have a consistent definition of done. Really important. And this was tough for me personally. Difficult to excite stakeholders with early thin slices. So right, one of the key tenets of agility and Scrum is you have thin slices, so you're always building something you can deliver. I went back, and as I was reading the sprint reviews, I honestly couldn't remember what we demoed at the first sprint review. We actually demoed a structure of a database. Woohoo! Really exciting to a P&L type person who's trying to deliver business value, right? It was absolutely the right thing to do because it did have business value. We just really struggled to show it to people and have them go, what the heck are they talking about? So that first sprint was hard. And some of the feedback that I got from the stakeholders was too much focus in early reviews on technology and not on business value. And what I've learned is you can turn technology into business value if you know how to do it. We didn't know how to do it back then. We would talk about databases and schemas and tables and indexes. And I remember distinctly sitting in like the second sprint review, and one of the business guys, he's a salesman by trade, sat right next to me. He leans over, he said, I have no idea what they're talking about. I'm going to have to trust you. This is of value. That's what he said to me. He had no idea. We got better at that. And we had a very hard time creating a shippable solution with enough value to deliver to the business in early sprints. I think if I could go back in my time machine, I think we probably could have done that a little differently, but it was hard. You know, we were sprinting along, sprint 4, sprint 5, sprint 6. About sprint 5 is where we had something that I think we could have pushed out and done some pilots with, but it was really hard to convince ourselves or anybody in that room. Okay? So those are really my lessons learned. I'm sure I have a ton more from those early days, but these are the key ones. So let's talk about best practices. There were some best practices in those early days that we're still following today, or at least we need to keep following. Don't go it alone early. The best advice I can give anybody in this room who's not done Scrum, don't assume you'll figure it out on your own. So yes, I haven't been to training, but I got to tell you, part of why I've survived is through the help of Centair and other folks who knew what they were doing. So it's very important to have Scrum team members trained. So even though I haven't been to train, most of my engineers have. And we have more training planned. We sent a certified Scrum trainer to India to train our India team. We have a group in India. Chad has fun stories about that he can tell you. You got to get your people trained. Give them the base. I don't have the base, so mine's all learned. Give them that chance to get the base. It's also really important, even on a small team, to have someone who's done it before. You may not always have that luxury, but man, I got to tell you, and I warned Gary I was going to pick on him a little bit, having Gary on that team was highly valuable to us because he had been there, done that. And you need some of that too. As we all know, we can all go to training and learn stuff, but you don't really learn until you do. And if you don't have at least one person you can lean on, it's tough. And then encourage, I hinted at this earlier, encourage open dialogue on misunderstood techniques. Don't blame that Scrum guy that we don't know who he is. Talk about it. What's the person really struggling with? Figure it out. We had some tough conversations early where people were struggling with concepts. And I think moving forward, what we learned is we've got to listen to what they're concerned about and then teach them how to fish a little more. And we've gotten better at that. I already hinted at this, but so some of these are best practices after the early phases. Document and maintain your definition of done. Make sure it's written down somewhere that everybody can see it. The definition has to be complete and consistent, especially when you have multiple teams. Even Scrum as a framework gives you a lot of room for flexibility, probably too much so for some of my coworkers in the room, for each team to behave a little differently inside the box, but outside the box and how they're delivering, that definition of done is critical. I can't overemphasize that enough. It's got to include not just the software, but the quality and delivery expectations. Software just compiled is useless, as we all know. It's got to have been tested. You got to know how you can deliver it, or else it's not really done. And that example I had earlier was an example of that. And it really should drive what you can show and take credit for at a sprint review. We learned that the hard way early. Now there's this, Chad smiles every time he comes to a sprint review now because there will be things that are not done, and they might be really cool things. We won't show them at a sprint review. We'll tell you it's in the next sprint, wait and see, but we won't show them anymore. We learned our way out of that because they do not meet our definition of done. And use the feedback in the sprint reviews. It's a powerful tool. We have no less than 60 to 70 people at every sprint review. And that doesn't even include all the developers. So it's gotten so big that we actually put most of the developers in another room and they watch from there. And then we have the product owners and the sprint, the Scrum masters, and then the key stakeholders all in a room. There's about 50 people in there. And it didn't start that way Because I think the stakeholders, when they came early, were like, oh boy, if I want to come learn about databases, I'll show up at one of these sprint reviews. But we've gotten better at it, and now we get pretty good participation. Whenever anybody asks me, how's it going? I'll tell them, but I'll say, if you really want to know, come to the next sprint review. As I'm going to tell you a little bit, we went to 3-week sprints, so nobody ever has to go more than 3 weeks without knowing where we are. So we encourage a lot of participation in these sprint reviews. And the feedback we got early from the stakeholders, which is the thing I spent a lot of time thinking about, we need a user story and we need a set of use cases. Yeah, it's great, you built this cool database, but what's the use case? So we had to think about that. The feedback from my management team, so I'm excluding, whenever I say management here, I'm mostly excluding myself. No surprise, focus on the stakeholders, not on each other. In the early sprint reviews, through no fault of their own, a lot of the engineers were asking technical questions of each other. Hey, how did you do that so-and-so thing? Guys, that's not what the sprint review's about. We're here to talk about the business value of what we did. So table that, talk about it in the retrospective, talk about it in your daily stand-up, go tap a guy on the shoulder and talk about it. So we had to change that behavior a little bit. But the feedback in the sprint reviews is key. You'll see that as a common theme as I go through this. Then we launched. So we were going merrily along, and what I would tell you, Scrum has no magic answers for growing pains. If you get really big, just like lots of processes, it gets hard. So we actually grew to 10 plus teams. Pretty big deal. And the primary motivation to do that, and we also went to 3-week sprints. Now that was actually the team's idea. I thought they were crazy, by the way. I was struggling with, how are you going to get anything done every 3 weeks? I was like, you guys should stay at 4 weeks. But I'm not a practitioner. I said, self-managing team, let them decide. They decided to go to 3 weeks. It's worked out pretty well. We have a couple teams, because they're smaller, that go every 6 weeks. So they're every other sprint they review their materials, but we went to 3 weeks. The primary motivator for building this so fast is there's a huge trade show in October called Green Build. It's the largest global show of what's happening in the green energy space. It was in Toronto last October. We really wanted to have something that we could show. And certainly the business expectation of what we would show there was far greater than our first minimum viable product. So we had to kind of get there. So that was our primary motivation to kind of grow pretty quick. I'm going to talk about that trade show again in a minute. What we found, no surprise, communication gets really hard across 10 teams. And what I would tell you is 3 of those teams are in India, 1 of those teams is in St. Louis, 1 of those teams in Philadelphia, and then 5 or so are in Milwaukee. So we got a lot of, remember all those variables I said before, right? I used to have a lot more here before this started. It's been tough. And it's really hard with remote locations. And a lot of times what I've seen in the past, when you have remote locations, you do a lot of documentation, especially if you got that 11.5 to 12-hour time shift where you have no overlap. We better write everything down, hand it off, and then they'll write it back, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in a lightweight agile process, you don't want to do that. Doesn't mean you don't write things down. I got lots of things I could show you that we've written down. But how do you get good at those challenges without falling back into your traditional document-heavy ways? It's tough. It's really tough. We also have a program management team, which does report to me as well, so I'm responsible for them as well. They have the responsibility to tell the business how it's going. Now, I just told you the sprint reviews is how you know how it's going, but that whole project management 101 scope, schedule, cost thing, we have program managers who have to report on all that, and they have to care about the entire picture. We've had some challenges there. Overall test strategy. Testing is very important, and I would tell you that I really love the way the Scrum teams have embraced regression testing and unit testing and feature testing. It's our responsibility for our widget to own the quality. That's gone pretty well. When you roll those 10 teams up into a product, it gets a little challenging. And you got to take a different approach than you do in the waterfall world. In the waterfall world where I came from, we would have 3 or 4 month validation test cycles at the end. So literally, no more software would be written, just bug fixes for 4 months. It's not going to work if you're using this process. Architectural oversight. We have a separate team, doesn't report to me, that's responsible for architecture and stewardship. They had to have a different approach. And to be honest, and they'd agree if they were sitting here, they struggled with it. Whoa, there's not reams and reams of documents I can go read, but we have a lightweight framework. How do I know whether these guys are following the architecture or not? I'm going to talk a little later about community of practice concept. We've really struggled with this one, but it's gotten better. And then planning for future releases, right? That dirty, evil term, right? Future releases. Requires a different approach. Despite all of our success with Scrum at Johnson Controls, I still get asked all the time, when are you going to have this thing done that's not in your plans yet? I don't get to avoid the question. I have to actually answer it differently now. And my program management team has to plan it differently. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay? And probably the hardest lesson we learned at the time of the launch, distractions will impact team velocity and results. Seems pretty obvious, right? If you pull somebody off a team, their velocity is going to change. Scrum does not address, nor does it preclude, the deployment of hosted software. Why do I mention that? Well, as I told you earlier, this is a hosted solution. So we've got all these Scrum teams building software. They're building really high quality software. We still have to deliver it through various hosted environments. And that is a dedicated team that does that now, but we really struggle with it. They aren't using Scrum to do that. They're a delivery mechanism. They're not a software development mechanism. We really struggle with that. And to be honest, we had a lot of our smart developers, for all the right reasons, helping to deploy the software. Okay, I built it, now I'm taking my Scrum hat off and I'm going to go deliver it. Well, we didn't really factor that into our sprint planning. We should have. So, as Ken mentioned earlier, you don't want to ever use the metrics of velocity to figure out what teams are going to get done. Let them do that. But my point here is, don't assume the team will be able to suck things up. It's just not fair to the team. And we had other people assigned to other things around the launch that had impact as well. This was a painful lesson we had to learn. Here's the good things. Community of practice is a good thing when it's done right. So we've been using it now for a while for shared topics across teams. Just one example, there's many. We probably got a little carried away with this, to be honest, but we've had some that have worked really well. Security is a big concern for all of us in this industry, especially when you put something out in a hosted site. You got people logging in, and you've got pretty critical building information. Yeah, I'm not in the banking industry, but there's still a lot of intellectual property there. IT security is kind of a big deal. I told you earlier we have one team called the Shared Services team that provides a lot of those services, but it's important that each team understands this. So we formed a community of practice around this. And as I watched these communities of practice form, I saw a couple of behaviors. Some of the teams would do exactly what I said not to do in that second bullet. Don't act like another team committing work. Community of practice should be come together, talk about some topics, I'll agree on a few things, go back to your teams. A few of our communities of practice were trying to commit to work. Didn't make sense. Make sure the work goes back to the teams. So I would tell you that of our communities practices, there's several. The security team has done a really nice job. They get together and then they say, okay, what does each team got to go do? What do they have to put in their backlog? What do they have to commit to? So there's really no work of business value coming out of those teams anymore. It's just their way to communicate. It's worked really well. It took us a while to get there. Who's familiar with spikes? I'm not sure how common a term that is. Okay, Ken is. This has become a popular thing that I like a lot. So one of the challenges or misconceptions of Scrum is if you're sprinting every 3 to 4 weeks, how do you manage something that could be 3 or 4 or 5 sprints long and you don't know anything about it? So the way I think, I don't know if this would fit any technical official definition of spike, but the way I think about it is the goal of a spike is to explore ideas and work which is unknown. I'll give you an example. In one of those applications I showed you earlier, we have a navigation tree like almost all applications do, navigate down the building and then have the data come up on the screen. The performance of that got really slow when we had a lot of data. We didn't know how to solve it. We had smart people who had ideas. We did not want to commit in a 4-week sprint to say we were going to be done with that. So what the team proposed is they do a spike on different technologies around database performance. Now it turns out the spike took a couple sprints, but it really yielded the results we needed so they could then go groom the work and commit to it in a future sprint. So I view spike as something that really doesn't have business value on its own. You could argue it does because it leads to business value, but as you're talking about business value in sprint reviews, we would talk about the spikes in the sprint review, but we would say it's something we're exploring right now. But when it's done, you can start planning the real work. We've had some good success with this. So I would encourage, don't get carried away. You can start spiking on too many things. Then you can have those technical debt problems that you don't want to have. But if you pick the right things, this works pretty well. There's a theme here. Use the feedback in the sprint reviews and the sprint retrospective. So I personally didn't have much visibility to the early sprint retrospectives. So for me to talk about them in that beginning phase would be disingenuous. But I went to a couple in this phase. And here's the feedback we were getting as we were about to launch in October at that trade show. From the stakeholders, they really appreciated the business value approach to the reviews. So we made that fundamental shift, which was great. Now when we go to sprint reviews, each team talks about what they're delivering, not how they built it, which is good. They may mention some details of what they did to build confidence in our performance or scale, but they're really talking about the business value. The management team at this phase, which will lead to probably my most controversial slide later about metrics following Ken, is they needed to see some quality and performance metrics. Got to see them, got to see them. It's not that we don't trust you guys, there's that trust issue, but we got to see some metrics, okay? So we took that in. And the team, once again, it's part of the lesson learned for me, don't ask us to suck up work if the resources are retasked. So in a couple of these middle sprints, the team, and rightfully so, showed up with not done items. Why are they not done? What did you guys do wrong? You pulled my guy who was working on that to go do that. That's okay. We still had enough done items to take credit, but you got to be aware of those things happening. Before I go to the release, in October we did go to that trade show, and it was wildly successful. And I got to participate, and it was great. So we had working software in October of last year that we demoed in a booth to a couple hundred customers and partners. And we actually had a team dedicated for about 8 weeks last summer, taking the software we're building, putting it all together into we basically built a data center that we could mobile take to Toronto. And that went really well. There are still debates in our organization, and Dave and Chad and I have talked about it. Could we have shipped right after that? Because we didn't. We started doing alpha and beta customers. Could we have mass marketed and shipped that thing? I'm going to talk a little bit about why we didn't. There's still some growing pains there, but we had a pretty cool product in October, and it was kind of fun to see the interaction with the team. Now let's talk about the release. So we launched it, told the whole world about our product in October, and then we said, and we're going to start doing work with lead customers, and then it'll be available for everybody soon. So it's a Johnson Controls tradition, which I kind of like and kind of don't, that we are very rigorous about starting with a small set of users and then fanning out. It's not necessarily a bad thing. You can build a business model around that. But we struggle with this. So the release is what we're doing right now. So next week we have a sprint review planned that will be the final sprint of software for our big release. And we're on track to deliver that to paying customers about 10 days later. So that's what the release is. So from the launch in October until now, we've had some interesting challenges. Deciding when to release is difficult the first time. So we haven't delivered this yet. So this is the first release. Who wants to use the first release of any software, right? Some people actually tweak their numbers so it's 3.0 even as the first one, right? It's tough. And how do you know when you got enough? So the transparency we've had in the sprint reviews really helps, but unshippable bugs are still just that. And we had some very interesting conversations as recently as 4 or 5 sprints ago. How many bugs do you have in the software? How many bugs do you have in the software? And I remember distinctly, Gary and I were sitting next to each other, and I refused to answer. I said, we have lots of bugs in the software, but we only have 2 unshippable bugs. The rest of those bugs are things we'll either plan later or they don't have enough business value to do. Got some pretty dirty looks from some of the people above me. But we've done a pretty good job of convincing people that software will have bugs. You got to decide what the value is of leaving those in or fixing them. We've struggled with this one a little bit, but it's gotten better. Everyone has a different take on minimum viable product. What's good enough to send out and sell? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. We struggle with that. When do we have enough? Lots of good conversations around that. And as I said, we did, after October, start going to customers in an alpha beta mentality. I think we're up to about 8 right now. And 8 doesn't sound like a big number, but when you're doing something as large as this, 8's a big number because we're doing a lot of data with each customer. And we're getting feedback, which is awesome. We all want feedback, right? As software developers, it's the things we crave. But you got to manage it because you can easily convince yourself, I can just add that next PBI to that next thing in the next sprint, and then the customer will be happy. And then hold the software back. It's a tough problem. The other lesson learned for me, since October, we've really done a lot of things that aren't visible in the user interface, but they're of high business value. So the way I think about it is there's absolute business value beyond new features, especially if you're working on a large-scale enterprise software solution. We've done a lot of things to improve the performance of our software. That has huge value to the customer. We had to convince ourselves that was of business value. And I would tell you, in this recent sprint reviews, the thing the stakeholders like most is when we show them the exact same thing they saw at the last review, but it's faster. So we're getting business value out of doing that. It was hard to convince ourselves of that. Because this is a hosted solution, we want to have a multi-tenant application with all of our users in one hosted location. We got to be able to scale. Scale is really important. And we've put a lot of work into our scale solution. That has high value to our business. If we add customer X plus one and we can't scale to the next one, our salespeople can't sell. So we've had a lot of conversations in recent sprint reviews about our scale strategy. Those things aren't always fun for the team, right? Most software people want to create, but it's really critical to the product. Moving forward, I think one of the things we're going to get better at is how do we be doing those things as we're developing new features? You know, there's a traditional mentality, which I hate, but I probably did it too, is get it working right and fast, right? You don't really want to build software that way. And we'll get in this when I talk about next steps. There is such a thing as too much all at once for delivery. It's been really hard to keep all 10 of those teams coordinated. We basically have a monolith of software. Now, it's not designed that way. It's pretty decoupled, but all 10 teams sprint together, and all 10 teams are going to deliver their first release together. Ugh, painful. We're going to talk about how we're going to break that up later. And you want to encourage some teams who say, you know what, I'm done with what the business wanted in that first delivery. I'm going to work ahead. And we have some teams doing that. But until we decouple, that's going to be a challenge. So some best practices in this phase. Here's my controversial statement based on what we talked about earlier. Data-driven metrics are king. I have to admit I'm one of those people who likes metrics, okay? But if you look at what's up here, the team did an excellent job of sharing performance metrics. And they also did an excellent job of showing some of the quality metrics. What I would tell you, reflecting on Ken's presentation, is the performance metrics are very valuable because they have business value. I would tend to agree with what he said. Those quality metrics are kind of a placebo right now for the management team to feel like it's of high quality. I think as we get better at this and there's a trust, we'll have less of a need for those quality metrics. So it's an interesting challenge. The other thing for those of you who have done Scrum, that release burn down chart that you use to see where you're at, and not everybody does that, but we've been doing it lately, start to show the different possible velocities of a team. That also builds confidence in this release mentality. I'm pretty confident moving forward we're going to get out of this release mentality. We're going to do updates. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I got to tell you, right or wrong, those metrics gave a lot of confidence to the people above me. Regular backlog grooming and release planning are key. So business leaders expect future releases, and you can't just tell them, well, in the next 3-week sprint, we'll have ... Well, what about beyond that? This gets hard. And I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to doing this. We've gotten decent at it. I don't want to say we're experts at it yet. But our program management team and our Scrum leadership, primarily the product owners and the Scrum masters, have gotten into a cadence of this that's pretty good. And the thing I've been encouraged by, because I sit in these meetings, is that self-directed team is growing to be self-directed at a Scrum of Scrums levels. There are times where a team will say, our velocity is X, and of course everybody knows your velocity only is your velocity. You can't share velocity among teams if you've done Scrum. That team over there doesn't have enough velocity to do that. Maybe we can pitch in and help, take it on. So we're starting to move work around, which is good. It's tough. Doing release planning is really tough. I wouldn't say it's any harder than any other process. Waterfall process may feel like it's going better because you could put it in a Microsoft project plan, but this actually can be really powerful concept if you get it right. And once again, broken record, use the feedback in the sprint reviews. So here's the feedback we've been getting lately, and there's a theme. The stakeholders are very excited about the product and want us to ship it. That's good. The management team likes those metrics. The quality's right, the performance is right, wants to ship it. And quite frankly, the team is ready to move on. They want to sprint on the next stuff. They want to ship it. So we're going to ship it. So what are the next steps? We need to reorganize a little bit. So with 10 plus Scrum teams all working on the same schedule, it's been really tough. So we've, once again, in the spirit of self-organization, a few of the engineers on my team came to me, and I smiled because number one, they had a proposal for this that I didn't ask for, they pitched it, and number two, they had talked to a lot of each other about it, so there was already buy-in. So they've found a way to actually reorganize our teams into 3 or 4 different groups where they can be on different cadences, but they're providing value to each other. This is really going to help us break this apart, so we're delivering software more frequently and in smaller chunks. It helps with dependencies and communication. Right now, if you were to go to one of our Scrum of Scrum meetings, or if you were to go to one of our community of practice meetings, there's way too many people in that room, which makes it hard to make decisions. We're going to have smaller groupings of that. We're really going to break it up. And I think we'll be able to create more business value in focused areas. When we have a sprint review for group 1, we won't necessarily need the people who care about group 2 and group 3. They'll be welcome to come, but we're going to get into more intimate conversations, I think, which is going to be good. We're going to plan an update schedule and stick to it. So I've told you for about 15 minutes about when's it good enough, when's it good enough, when's it good enough. I won't live that way anymore. It's too hard. So we're planning to, every sprint or every other sprint, depending on the business tolerance for it, release software, release software, release software. We have an opportunity that we haven't had before, having nothing to do with Scrum, but having everything to do with the technology we're using. We're hosted. So when we update the software, everybody gets it. So that version management issue that Ken talked about before, man, I lived that pain for years. It's hard. We're going to try and use both the technology and the process we have here to not let that happen. Doesn't mean we might not support the previous update for a little while, but we're going to try and avoid that. There's 5 versions out in the wild. And we know everybody logs into the same place, so we know what everybody's doing, so that helps. The business acceptance will grow as well, right? That, well, there's another release in 12 months, you better keep putting more in that sausage casing. If we're doing an update every 3 to 6 weeks, it won't matter. They're going to see value, and they'll be able to market around it and sell around it. And once again, trying to get to smaller, manageable chunks. And then this is my sales pitch for the group, and then I'm going to take questions. Usually this is done as a recruit and retain, but I've actually got some good people. I'm trying to retain and recruit more agile talent. So if anybody in this room is interested in being a consultant through Centair or being an employee at Johnson Controls and doing this, come talk to me, because we're still growing. So that's what I had to share. Now I'd love to take some questions. And Dave wanted to remind me that if you ask a good question or even an okay question, we might have a prize for you. Over here. Oh, got a few hands. Good. I'm sick of hearing myself talk.
What is the size and composition of your teams?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. You talked about the
Yes.
10 teams started with 1 and up to 10. What is the size and composition of those teams?
The smallest team we have is actually 3 developers, which is tough. The biggest team we have is probably 9 or 10, and that's getting a little big. So in that 6 to 8 range would be good. Quite honestly, the small teams are only small because there's only a few people in those offices. We haven't figured out, and I'd love to hear if anybody has any ideas on how to do this, to have a Scrum team be in multiple locations. It's just really hard. The daily stand-ups get complicated. But in general, most of the teams are right size. We have a couple that are too small and one that's too big.
We have a lot of people working here and in other locations. What changes you had to make, any performance reviews and HR practices?
That's a good
question.
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer to that, but we do goal setting every year at our company, like a lot of companies do. And the thing I asked my managers to do with their employees for this year is to make sure everybody had a quality goal, everybody had an innovation goal, and everybody had a business expectation goal. And having reviewed all those, because I have to review all the ones they wrote, some of the developers have put in specific goals around what they're doing in their Scrum practice, others haven't. It's a great question that I think will evolve over time. I love your question. I don't have a better answer than we've done a little bit of goal planning.
Are you the functional manager for the teams, or are you just focusing on product management?
No, so I have 5 engineering managers that report to me, and then all the developers and QA people report to them. So my managers need to be able to answer your question because it's a good one.
How do you handle releases? Do you have a team that is responsible for preparing a release, or do they also operate on sprints, or do you have a dedicated group that is responsible for tasking and preparing shippable release?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've struggled with that a little bit. We're trying to stay true to the self-organization around quality and work and owning your own work and knowing how it fits into others. I would tell you in full disclosure, we do have a system test team right now. That makes a lot of people cringe from an agility standpoint. we're doing it a lot by people knowing each other and communicating those communities of practice, but getting the cadence between teams and what they own and don't own has been tough. And I think some of us who are still a little set in our old ways want a little bit of that program level oversight. I think we'll grow out of that over time, both in terms of testing and in terms of the interrelations and the updates. You know, you think about how do you update software, and do you have to update it all at once? We're going to have to get better at that.
So right now you do have a gated code that tests and builds a release, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the question, do we have a dedicated group that builds and delivers the software? We have a build management team, which I think we'll always have, but they've needed help from the sprint teams. So part of that distraction, and it's a necessary one, is when we get near the end of sprints, we have people from the sprint teams having to help do that. I think we're going to get better at that. I think it's part of that levels of maturity thing. I'm going to follow you, Dave, so I can see who's asking me questions here.
When you started up, you said that you were going through some growth pains. How did you initiate the whole, using Scrum process with your teams? Was there education here? Did you come down, did you send your people down for education? You said you had one experienced person on the team that had done it before. Retrospectively, looking back on it, what would you recommend for
It's a great question. What I remember, and Chad will throw things at my head if I remember it wrong, is Chad came in and did a presentation for the management team on what Scrum was. And he got mixed feedback, if I'm being honest, right, Chad? And some people were very skeptical. I'd say about half of us in the room were on board and half weren't. So we started there. And at the risk of sounding arrogant, I've been with the company long enough that even though my boss was a little skeptical, he said, Scott, I trust you enough, do what makes sense to you. So we started the process. So the first thing we did is we asked for Center to bring in one or two people who knew Scrum. Gary Pedretti, who's in the room here, was the first one in. And then we did send people to training. I don't remember when we sent people to training, Chad. Had we sprinted for a little while? Or we trained first, didn't we? Yeah, we trained first. So I would say do those things. Even if you're going to get resistance from stakeholders or management to here's what Scrum is, do it anyway, right? Then send your people to training. And then I would highly recommend, as I said in the slides, make sure you got some experience on the team. So we really to be honest, we literally, I can remember it vividly, Dave and Chad and I had a conversation and I just said, I'm all in. And one of the things that, I'm not a stubborn person by nature and I'm willing to change, but once I decide to go a direction, I'm sort of like that movie where go fast in that direction, if something gets in your way, turn. That's how I am, so I just sort of went. And I would recommend you do the educate, train, bring in at least one or two experienced people. That's my personal experience and that worked pretty well.
Did you find that your definition of done evolved over time? And if so, was it project specific because of where you were in the timeline, or was it more because you were, as a group, more educated in Scrum?
It's a great question. I'd say both. It evolved because of where we were, but I think even more so because of maturity. So, like I mentioned in the presentation, I don't even quite honestly remember the first definition of done because it probably wasn't written down. But the team started sharing in that middle period, every sprint review, because I think quite honestly they were worried about each other, not so much the stakeholders. They would start the presentation, our chief product owner would start the presentation with the definition of done. Almost in a good way, self-directed teams, by the way, this is what we expected of everybody, this is how you should judge this review. And we started adding in what level of our environments did it have to be through. We have a development environment, a QA environment, a UAT environment, where it had to be in the process, what regression versus unit versus feature tests had to be done. I think, now that I think about your question, it was more about maturity, less about where it was. I think we could have used, there's no reason we couldn't have had the definition we have now even early. But I think it says people, to be honest, I think they were marshaling each other. It started growing because they started seeing behavior they didn't like with each other, and they said, we got to add that to the definition. That's what I remember happening.
So your definition has decreased in numbers versus increased?
I think it's stabilized.
Stabilized.
Yeah, I think it reached a point where it was good enough and we didn't have to add to it. I don't think we've changed the definition of done in several sprints. I think it's been pretty consistent now.
We got a new change.
What's that?
We got a new change.
Oh, well, Gary says we have a new change. I guess I'll learn about that when I get back. But it's that level of maturity thing. You know, you don't want too much overweight stuff, but we've never had a definition that took more than half a page, and I'm sure we won't let that happen.
The more recent changes are around automating delivery. The more recent changes are around automating delivery. So just kind of realizing some of that pain that we've got with pulling from teams to actually help DevOps with deploys, things like that. Really painful. We need to have all of that automated every time. Otherwise, you're not done.
That's a good point. I mentioned it in my presentation. I kind of glossed it over, that whole idea of deploying the software. We didn't have a team that did that 6 months ago. Now we have a really good team that does that. And some of the teams, when they change their software, they don't update their scripts or their information about what's going to get updated. So that's part of that definition Gary's talking about. That's a good one, Gary. Nice continuous improvement I didn't know about. What else?
To your definition of done, was it when you started off? Did you try to implement a definition of done for all teams, or did each team adapt their own definition of done? And then how did you audit that?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that despite our best efforts of trying to have everybody have the same definition done early, we probably didn't. So I think each team probably had a subset of the common definition. And then as we went along, we had a standard definition done that everybody had to follow. I don't honestly know how we audited it. I know who I'd like to audit it. Should be Scrum Master, should really make sure the team's following the definition done so that when the product owner says, this is good, we're there. So I've put a lot of pressure on our Scrum Masters lately. I've been very, very pleased with our product owners. I've been probably too tough on our Scrum Masters. So the audit it should be once again, each team should feel the ownership of that. But the reason the Scrum Master is there to help the team follow the process, I view that as part of their role.
Just jump in.
Yeah, Chad, please jump in.
I was heavily involved in this early on in the transition here to Scrum, and the teams did start out with a very lightweight definition of done that was applicable to all teams. And from there, they added, or really just added and evolved, extended that definition of done as needed. But there was one common base for that definition of done. So when you said done, it at least meant this list of things.
Did it become like a policy that you created and you kind of held teams to, saying that this needs to be a policy we need to finish on? And you could sprinkle more, but it needs to be. Is that
Yeah, and actually, Chad always remembers these things better than I do. I think early he would know, he was there. We had a definition done, maybe not everybody was following it. Now it's expected that you follow it. And I would view it as a policy that we need to follow.
It's just an implicit checklist that the team goes through and says, do we do this? Yes. Do we do this? Yes. And it's yes or no questions. Are we at 95% code coverage? Yes. If not, we're not done. So those types of question and answers in a checklist form.
I'll take one last question. Head back.
So from a product development perspective, when you started out on day one with this to the point of October, how long was that?
Roughly, I'm just going to use rough numbers, it was about a year, a little less actually.
Okay, so and to ship it still is about the 18 months.
It'll be a little less than that, but it'll be close to that, yep.
So how does that compare to past, projects of this nature?
It's a good question. For the first release of a major initiative at Johnson Controls, which this is my fourth one, I think the previous ones were all over 2 years. So last October, and rightfully so, at the launch, my boss's boss was, quite frankly, bragging in a good way about how we'd done it in under a year to get to launch. I think what we've struggled with, just in full transparency of the group here, is from launch to now, why didn't we ship it? We have that conversation all the time. But yeah, it's 2+ years normally for these big things. The thing I'm excited about, to be brutally honest, is this may have taken too long to get the first one out, but what I'm excited about is the second one. The second one's actually planned for April. So we're going to do a software update. Granted, it's not a major update. We're going to do our first update 2 sprints later. And those things I told you were 2 years, the first update of all those was 6 months away. So it'd be fun to come back next year and tell you how many updates we did, because it won't be 1 or 2 like it would be traditionally.
We might take you up on that.
All right, be happy to come back.